بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أما بعد. To continue in the study of Nukhbatul Fikr in the science of hadith written by Al-Hafidh ibn Hajr rahimahullah, we're still continuing in the different affairs pertaining to the narrator of the hadith. So he continues and he says, if two narrators narrate from a shaykh and one of them passes away earlier, then they are called As-Sabiq, the one who dies earlier, and Al-Lahiq, the one who dies later. What that means is, a shaykh there's a shaykh who is young, for example, someone older narrates from him, and then later on, someone younger narrates from him. So Imam Muqbar rahimahullah, he mentions, As-Sabiq wal-Lahiq is when a shaykh who is young, someone who is older narrates from him. Then this shaykh has a long life, and another man narrates from him. Thus between the narrating of the two, between the first and the second student, maybe 80 to 100 years at times. Maybe 80 to 100 years at times. Or even more. Al-Hafidh ibn Hajr, he mentions that he's found something up to 150 years. Up to 150 years difference between the first and the second student. Al-Khatib Al-Baghdadi authored regarding this subject as well. But a benefit here is that this doesn't have great importance. This doesn't have a great importance knowing that he had a student that died at this age and that age. But just the scholars, they mention it to show this form of narrations as well. But majority of those narrations that come with this kind of isnad, this kind of chain, they're not authentic. Majority of the stories or the narration that come like this, that the shaykh had a student between the two students 100 and 200 years or 300 years, majority of them are not authentic. But the scholars, they mention it by way of al-fudul, something which is extra that they enjoy mentioning. Then he says, now this is more important in it, if a narrator relates from two shaykhs whose names are the same and they cannot be differentiated between the two except by one who specializes in narrating from them, then it is a must to clarify. What does that mean? Let's say Imam Bukhari rahimahullah, for example, he narrates Ahmed from Ibn Wahhab, Ahmed from Ibn Wahhab. He doesn't mention who this Ahmed is here. It could be either Ahmed ibn Isa or Ahmed ibn Salih. So here, for example, Bukhari, he says, I relate from Ahmed, who relate to me from Ibn Wahhab, without ascribing him to a father or to a grandfather or to a state or a land. So here it could be either Ahmed ibn Salih or Ahmed ibn Isa. If both these narrators are trustworthy, then there's no need to investigate. If both these narrators are trustworthy, there's no need to investigate further. Why? Because whether it's Ahmed ibn Salih or Ahmed ibn Isa, and they both narrate from the narrator Ibn Wahhab, it doesn't matter if it's one of the two. We're both are trustworthy in this case. But if they are not trustworthy, if one of them is not trustworthy, then in that case, what you will do is that you would have to investigate. If you cannot clarify who it is, then you look at the side affairs, the side factors. For example, if Ash-Shafi rahimahullah narrated this narration, example, in Egypt or in Baghdad. This one he met in Egypt, this one he met in Baghdad. So if you're to come across, you say, oh, but this one you relate in Egypt, so it must be this one. And this one's in Baghdad, it must be this one. There's side factors you can identify at times. But what this means is basically, if a narrator narrates from two shaykhs and their name is the same, or lineage, or the father and the grandfather names are the same, and one cannot distinguish between the two, if they're both trustworthy, there's no problem. But if one is not trustworthy, then that is where the issue occurs, and that's where it becomes more difficult to try to identify where the problem is. So this is something which is, when you're looking at chains and doing i'tibar and doing those things, that you come across. Then he says, if he denies what is related from him categorically, then the report will be rejected. You find at times that the human's mind at times forgets things. Not all the time you're going to remember something. Maybe you relate something 10 years ago and someone memorized it from you and comes to you 10 years later, do you remember that statement you said? And you completely forgot about it. So if that occurs, it occurs to narrators of science of hadith as well, or the narrators of hadith as well. if someone says that I heard such and such from this individual, and the Imam or the Shaykh, he said, he lied against me. He said, La, I didn't relate this, he lied against me. Or I didn't relate this, and he says a firm statement that this is not his statement, then this narration is rejected. This narration, what is correct, is rejected. If someone relays from someone something, and he says, no, that's a lie against me, I never said that, then that narration is rejected. If he outwardly clearly says that this is not my statement, I never said this, I never relayed this narration, then it is rejected. But what if he's doubtful? What if he's doubtful, and he says, I don't remember, or he has doubt regarding it? Then the correct opinion is that the narration is accepted. For that reason, you'll find in some of the chains, for example, it comes from Suhail ibn Abu Salih, from his father, from Abu Hurairah, from the Prophet ﷺ. This narration, one of the narrators called Abdul Aziz Muhammad ad-Darawardi, he said, this narration was related to me by Rabi' ibn Abu Abdurrahman, from Suhail. So Abu Muhammad, or Abdul Aziz, he said, I went to Suhail and I asked him about it. He said, I don't know. He said, I don't know if I relate this narration. So I said to him, Rabi'a relayed to me from you, you said such and such. So Suhail would say after that, Rabi'a narrated from him that I relate to him from my father. Meaning he would mention the statement that Rabi'a said that I narrate to him from my father. Because he was doubtful regarding it. So in this case, the narration is still accepted. If you come across something like this, the narration, the correct stance is that it is still accepted. Now, the last one he mentioned is Musalsal. Musalsal, anyone know Musalsal narration is? Those who memorize Baykuniya, what is Al-Baykuni saying it? كذاك قد حدثنيه قائما. What's after? وبعد أن حدثني تبسما. That similar is the narration of the one who narrated to me standing up, or after he narrated to me, he smiled. What Al-Musalsal means is that from the beginning of the chain to the end of the chain, each narrator says a statement or does an act, and they all do it. Example of that is, you find in some of the narrations, they'll say, some of the scholars give example, I heard so-and-so say, سمعت فلان يقول كذا وكذا. Then the second person will say, سمعت فلان يقول كذا وكذا. Then the third one will say, سمعت فلان يقول كذا وكذا. That is musalsal. Meaning each narrator says the same as the one previous to him. Or it could be in actions. For example, he narrated to me this hadith while he was touching his beard. The second one will come as well, who narrates the hadith will touch his beard, and the guy relaying from him will say, he narrated to me this hadith while he was touching his beard. Until the end of it. But the reason Al-Baykuni said that he related to me while he was standing up, or after he related to me, he smiled. Meaning each narrator narrated a certain, the action they performed, they narrated it the same way. So this one was standing while he narrated to me. Then the second one was standing while he narrated to the third one. The third one was standing while he narrated to the fourth one. All of them had the same action in the chain of narration. This is called musalsal, that they all had a statement or an action that each narrator in that chain of hadith relayed. Then he says, the phrases used to relay narrations are as follows. Now this is where you'll find in the books of hadith, if you open Bukhari or you open Muslim or Abu Dawood or Tirmidhi or any of them, you'll find a chain narration, you'll hear sami'tu, you'll read sami'tu, I heard, وحدثني, that he relayed to me. So the phrases that are used, they fall into 8 categories, or there are 8 levels. Some are stronger than the rest. As we mentioned before, at times something may be stronger than the other one. The first 2 are the strongest that he mentions here, sami'tu and haddathani. If you see sami'tu and haddathani, those are the 2 strongest phrases you can see when relaying hadith. Sami'tu means I heard, and haddathani means he relayed to me, or he narrated to me. So this is a student saying directly that I heard from my teacher, or that my teacher directly narrated to me. It could also be used in a plural sense. For example, sami'na. If you're in a sitting with more students and you relate to all of you, you'll say, we heard. Or it was relayed to us. Those are both okay as well. The second level is akhbarani. Akhbarani, he informed me, or qara'tu alayh, or I read to him. He informed me, or I read upon him. So he was reading to him a book. The third level is when a narrator of hadith says, وَقُرِعَ عَلَيْهِ وَأَنَا أَسْمَعُ. It was read to the teacher or the sheikh while I was listening. Whilst I was listening. After that comes أَنْبَأَنِي. he informed me. Now, in the English language, they basically translate similar to these things, but they have more meaning with the scholars of hadith. أنبأني, he informed me. ثم, after that, number 5 will be ناولني. Nawalini means he put it in my hands, meaning the teacher gives his student a book and he says, narrate from me. Take this book and narrate from me. This is a form of an ijaza. This is a form of an ijaza. So he gives you a book, he says, narrate this from me, with the condition that the teacher permits that narration of that book that he gave you. It's a form of ijaza, nawalini. The next one is also a form of ijaza, which is shafahani, which means that he told me verbally. He told me verbally. And next week we'll come to ijaza, the subject of ijaza in more detail. And the number 7 is that he said, kataba ilayya. He wrote to me. He wrote to me. This is also a form of an ijaza. You find here that the best of them are those which you hear directly from the teacher himself. سمعت حدثني أخبرني. Ijaza comes much after. Ijaza comes much after in ranking. For that reason, you find people killing themselves for ijazat and rushing to get ijazat. And some of them, as one of them informed me once, that he sat with a sheikh and the sheikh gave him a big book of his asanid. And he said, this is my book to you, now take care of it. This is ijaza for you. This form of ijazat don't have no benefit. And that individual, if you were to ask him a simple question about belief and other than that, he won't know anything. But people nowadays, they kill themselves for ijazat. But the scholars, their main concern was not ijazat. Their concern was سمعت وحدثني. I heard and he informed me. So he used to sit at the feet of the scholars and study and listen. Their main intent was not just to get ijazat. Nonetheless, we'll study more about ijaza next week, inshallah. So these last 4, or the last 3 mentioned, nawalani and shafahani, and also he said kataba ilay. These are forms of ijazat. These are forms of ijaza. Permission of relaying the narration from him. The last one is an. An, which means from. Now this is problematic, as you mentioned before. Anyone remember why an will be problematic? There's a reason why. What is that narrator called that has an issue with using the word an? Mudallis. A narrator who's mudallis, he uses the word an. He uses an. Why? At times he may be hiding a weak narrator. Or at times he's trying to make it seem as he heard from someone or more than a specific individual. As we mentioned the details regarding that before. Now, an is problematic when they mention it at the end of the class, inshallah. But the first 2 ways of narrating are used by narrators who heard directly from the teacher. Example, سمعت and حدثني. If you heard directly from the teacher, then you can say, yes, I heard from him, or he relayed to me. Or if you're sitting in a sitting, we heard from him, and it was relayed to us. The first one is the most explicit. سمعت is the best one. سمعت is the best one, because حدثني, as we'll learn later on, may have some issues with how some of the scholars, they used it. But سمعت is the best of them. Now the third and fourth one, which is أخبرني and قرأت عليه, that he informed and I read to him, are for someone who read to the sheikh while alone. Are used for someone who read to a teacher. Now, أنبأني, that he informed me, is basically a form of ijazah as well. For that reason, it's on the lower level. Similarly, the rest of the ones that we mentioned are ijazat, and they're lower level. We'll discuss next week, inshallah. The point is here, and now you know some of the ways that the scholars of the past used to relay narration. For that is when you open Bukhari and you see the chain. حدثني فلان, حدثني عن فلان, حدثني فلان, قال فلان, سمعت عن فلان. These are all statements that they're using to relay chains of narration. And it comes in importance when you start checking narrations, what kind of phrase they use. Did they use سمعت? Did they use حدثني? Did they use عن? Did they use ناولني? Did they have الوجادة, that they found something? These are all important. And inshallah, the next book we study, we'll study with some tahqiqat of some of the scholars to show us how the scholars came to understanding of the grades of narration, the different ways they came to the understanding of grade narration. So this is like a muqaddimah, as an introduction to that which will come later on of us going through a work of a scholar where he studies chains, inshallah. Then he says here, As for an, then this is the weakest form. Why? Because it has to do with an'ana, which is that a person says, and fulan, report to me from so and so. What this means is, if someone who is mudallis, someone who does tadlis, what that means is that a person is hiding maybe a weak narrator, or he has issues with being clear who you narrated from. Some narrators, if they report with the word an from, and they are mudallis, their narrations are rejected. Their narration are rejected. Now, if he's not mudallis and he narrates with an, there's no problem. As long as, there's no problem. But if he is mudallis, someone who does this kind of form of relaying from weak narrators and hiding their reality and trying to beat around the bush at times, this kind of individual, his narration is not accepted until he openly, clearly states that he heard from so-and-so. And does not just say from so-and-so. He has to say clearly, tasrihan, clearly that I heard from so-and-so, he narrated me this. Because why? His narrations have issues if he uses the word an. Now, he mentions here, the last point we'll take for today, is that the scholars of hadith have mentioned that from the conditions for the acceptance of the hadith is that the meeting of the two individuals be proven. This is the condition of Imam Bukhari rahimahullah. That he said that the two narrators, in order for them to narrate from each other, they must have been proven that they met each other. Now, some of the scholars they held this to be the preferred opinion. And the stance of Imam Muslim rahimahullah was that so long as they're in the same time period, ma'imkan al-luqi, and they're able to have met, it is acceptable to them to narrate from each other. So some of the scholars said no. If they have not proven to have met each other, they cannot narrate from one another. The narration is not accepted. So their stance was a bit more stricter, and this was the stance of Imam Bukhari. This is for one of the reasons, as I mentioned before, the Imam Bukhari's book, Sahih al-Bukhari, was put forth in front of Sahih Muslim. But Imam Muslim's statement is not rejected either. Imam Muslim's statement was that if they are in the same time period, and they have the possibility of meeting each other, then the narration from one another is accepted. The narration from one another is accepted. Now this, as I mentioned before as well, when we go into studying that book in which he mentions chains of narration and he grades upon them, it will come into importance, you knowing and understanding the different terminology scholars use. It's important for us to understand that this is knowledge the same way learning about wudu and learning about salah and learning about other aspects is knowledge. There's knowledge which is ulum al-ala, and there's knowledge which is ulum al-ghaya. There's knowledge which is the intent that you're trying to reach, the goal that you're trying to get to, which is knowledge of aqidah, knowledge of fiqh, and knowledge of hadith, and other than that. And there's some forms of knowledge and sciences which is ulum al-ala, the tools you need to get to that. If you don't understand this science, you may start using weak hadith. And by way of using weak hadith, you fall into innovations, you fall into shirk, you fall into different aspects of destruction, such as you committing an act and believing something to be okay, and then it leads you to be falling yourself into a loss or destruction. For that reason, it's important to study this science as a tool to get to your goal, which is to study and understand the narration of the Prophet ﷺ, and understand when the scholar says that this narration is mawdu', this narration is sahih, this narration is da'if. What does that mean? That is what the intent behind this is. We'll stop with this much. If there's any quick question, we'll take now. If not, continue next week.